President Obama increasing, intensifying the war in Afghanistan, even as he draws down in Iraq?
I'm troubled by what's happening in Afghanistan. I agree with those who believe that it's not a case of a surge winning a military solution. That's not what's going to happen. Indeed, what needs to happen is to define what will be progress that will enable a withdrawal of those troops that are in Afghanistan. And it will be multifaceted, and it will involve building regional leaders to make sure they may not be fully democratic, but that there is peace and that women can send their children to school, including the girl child in particular, that there is an order that can help the Afghan people to move forward. They had a terrible time during the Taliban regime. They had a terrible time before that. They need to be able to have a country that moves forward. But a military solution on its own is not going to be viable. Already, Kabul is less secure than it was a year ago or even 6 months ago. People are very worried. And it does need a concerted approach. It needs the neighbours. It needs Iran and Pakistan to be involved in the way forward. So it needs new relationships between the United States and Iran as part of addressing that issue.
And do you see that happening?
I think it is possible. I think that the elections that are coming up in Iran pose a very interesting issue. If former President Khatami were to be elected, that could change the dynamic overnight.
And yet, if he weren't, I mean, now President Bush, of course, certainly is sounding the war drums in Iran. Do you see President Obama taking a different position there?
I think it's very important that we learn from mistakes of sounding war drums, and particularly doing it as the United States, whether the rest of the world cares, as happened in particular initially in the war on Iraq. Yes, the United Kingdom did join, but there was a real resistance, and there were many people within the United Kingdom who did not support the alliance that paved the way for that war, and it has caused a lot of damage. So I think what we need to learn, and I do believe that this is the message that President Obama is sending, we need to learn to build again the multilateral approach and the regional support approach to particularly difficult problems. We saw that in relation to North Korea. The 6 countries working, 5 of them with the United States, and still continuing to work. We need a similar type of built alliance in that region, because there's such a connection from the Middle East now to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, and even with the Mumbai incidents, India, and the tensions there. So we need to see an approach which builds on the strengths of working with neighbours and listening and trying to have long-term solutions.
You were the head of the Durban Conference on Racism right before the September 11th attacks.
I was the Secretary General. The chair of the conference was in fact South Africa, and the Foreign Minister of South Africa. In a way, I had that invidious thing where I was responsible in one sense as Secretary General of the conference, but not the political lead. The political lead came from South Africa, and thankfully that political lead succeeded in getting an end result, which was a programme of action and a declaration which had no anti-Semitic language whatsoever, which had dealt with the issues. But it was too late. The anti-Semitism in the street, the way in which the NGO declaration contained bad language, so I, as High Commissioner, had to reject it. These stayed in the mind. Now we have a review of what in fact was a good outcome. Can we step back? It will be in Geneva in April, and it's a review conference about what countries should have done to improve their situation on racism. And that's what it should be. But unfortunately, once again, because of what happened recently, particularly in Gaza, it may well be that some will want to use it to foster anti-Semitism. I hope not.
And your thoughts on the Israeli assault on Gaza?
I was in Gaza in early November and saw the suffering of a people under siege. And they asked, why are we getting no dividend from the truce that had been in operation for 5.5 months? The UN was very disturbed because they had building materials, $150 million worth of building materials to help to build clinics and schools and give some jobs in Gaza. They couldn't get this material in. School books weren't allowed to get into Gaza. It was strange. And then I was there on the morning of Obama's victory speech. I watched it from a hotel in Jerusalem. And that same morning, I was told that the Israelis had broken this temporary truce, gone in, they'd killed 6 Hamas fighters because they were closing a tunnel that might be used to kidnap a soldier. Frankly, nobody found that credible because there were lots of tunnels. Everybody knew that, and they were subsequently bombed, many of them. And there is a fear about getting material in. But why on the morning that President Obama was giving his victory speech was there an incident provoked by Israel? Everybody questioned that. The UN questioned it, journalists, people in the street. After that, things deteriorated. And I wondered about the timing of going into Gaza. Was it done during that period when you had an outgoing administration that wasn't going to object before you had an incoming administration that might have taken a different approach? One way or another, for the people of Gaza, it was devastating.
And the timing being, of course, the last Israeli soldiers leaving on the day of the inauguration, right before the inauguration of President Obama.
I think these are all factors that have to be taken into account.
And the number of people who died then, more than 1,400 Palestinians.
And don't get me wrong, when I was speaking in Gaza, I took up this issue of the missiles that were sent by Hamas to kill or injure innocent civilians. I went to Zidrat, the town, met the mayor. I absolutely condemn what Hamas does, and that also should be a subject of inquiry. And unfortunately, the Human Rights Council passed a resolution seeking a fact-finding mission to only look at what Israel had done. And I don't think that's a human rights approach. That we need an inquiry to look at the violations of international humanitarian law by potential violations by all sides.
And why do you think Hamas was sending those rockets into southern Israel?
I presume, it hadn't been happening except very incidentally, and I think not by Hamas, but by some other groups during that period of that temporary truce during the 18-month siege. A siege and a blockade of 1.5 million people on a small strip is a terrible thing. It's collective punishment. And when you see it on the ground, it is awful. And so there was that incident on the 4th of December, and then things deteriorated, and Hamas started to send out more missiles, and the Israelis
on the 4th of November?
On the 4th of November, I'm sorry, yes. And then it deteriorated after that, and Hamas refused to renew the truce. I had been urging that they would renew it, but actually, you at least have some understanding of the pressures when you see, the incidents that were happening.
And what do you think of the role of the U.S., the responsibility of the U.S. with the billions of dollars it gives to Israel?
Well, it's giving billions of dollars now also to help to rebuild in Gaza, which I'm very pleased about. I think it's $900 million, which will be very vital. And it is important that it gets to the wider population in Gaza. But the United States is vital to a solution. And what is really vital is that somebody of the caliber of George Mitchell does what he did in Belfast, goes and stays there. Somebody said to me, and I think it's a very wise decision, he could base himself in Cyprus. He could be there with a sense of real focus and continuity. And then when Secretary of State Clinton goes, she goes knowing that it's not a sporadic, it's a full-time concentration. And then it needs the quartet, it needs the new actors who are playing more of a part in, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Qatar. These are countries that now have some role to play, and they should be encouraged.
Should the U.S. be speaking to Hamas?
I personally believe so, yes, but
Why?
I know it's a very difficult decision.
Why?
Because I don't believe that there will be a solution without that. There were many times when the United Kingdom government said we will not speak to the IRA, and they were speaking to them. So there may be backdoor channels. I hope there are.
President Mary Robinson, I want to thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Mary Robinson is the former president of Ireland. She's the first woman ever to hold the office, also the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She's been the honorary president of Oxfam International since 2002. She is now the head of the International Commission of Jurists.